And so just sort of a preamble to where we're roughly at right now, we've looked at East Asian history probably up until about the first half of the first millennium AD, okay? We looked at the formation of the state. We've also looked at how, I guess, the flow of culture, particularly statecraft culture, from China or North China through into places like the Korean Peninsula and Japan, allowed them to think about how they would set themselves up administratively. And then in turn, obviously, that had a tremendous impact on Korean society, on Japanese society. And then obviously, eventually leading to the formation of fairly strong states, both on the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, okay? So today we will look at that issue, I think, in a slightly more depth, but particularly thinking about, I think, the effects of such centralization or consolidation processes over a significant period of time. So much so that by the time we got to the 7th to the 9th centuries, I think that project was pretty much complete. And what we have, therefore, then is the context upon which to think about very interesting things like the state sponsorship of religion, learning, the effects of cultural sort of interactions, especially with the rest of the world, but particularly within the three sort of, countries or cultural groups of China, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula. And then ultimately, what were some of the effects of all of that interaction? So when we think about the state of affairs in East Asia up until about the first millennium AD, one of the things that we have to bear in mind, obviously, is that East Asia was experiencing, I think, a series of political fragmentations and reorganization up until roughly about the 6th century AD. And the result of that, obviously, was that it wasn't necessarily a period of decline, but more a period of readjustment and consolidation, right? So that we would be looking at East Asia interacting diplomatically, so China and its kingdoms, interacting with places like Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and the kingdoms there, as well as with Japan in a diplomatic manner. There were lots of state exchanges that were going on up until about the 6th century AD and beyond, but it started in the first millennium AD. And then along with that are interesting sociocultural flows that came with things like migration and travel because of the facilitation of interaction at the state level. One of the things that we think about, I think, when we look at this sort of, run up to the 6th centuries AD, was that China, after 220 AD, essentially politically collapsed. It broke up into 3 kingdoms and then subsequently into 16, before consolidating into another 4 or 5 by about the 5th centuries AD. So in Chinese historiography, they typically call this period the period of disunity. In some ways, it's a bit of a misnomer because it's not so much that that China always had to be united, but the idea that you didn't have one dynastic house ruling over much of the Chinese landmass, right? Until about 589 AD, when the Sui dynasty manages to consolidate almost all the Chinese lands under one single rule, which is under their own dynastic house. And then they declare the beginning of the Sui dynasty. Doesn't last for very long, but within 20 years, by about 618 AD, a rival sort of family line of that same dynastic clan took over rule and established what was known as the Tang Dynasty. And this Tang Dynasty goes on for about almost 300 years to 906 AD. And once the Tang Dynasty collapses in 906 AD, it's only a 50-year sort of period of disunity. And by about 960, the whole of China again is consolidated under a single dynastic rule known as the Song Dynasty, and that goes on to 1278 AD. Same thing in Japan as well. If we think about the first half of the first millennium AD, we were looking at the Yamato period. We looked at the Kofun tombs a couple of weeks ago. But the main thing to think about is that the Yamato state, right, is formed basically as a conglomeration of quite a number of different autonomous fiefs, okay? And it's not until about 538, under the rule of the Asuka period, that you get all these fiefs coming together to acknowledge one person as a key ruler or king over them, okay? And that continues into what is known as the Nara period, which is the 8th century. So from roughly about 701 to 794. And then from the Nara period, and it's called Nara because it's where the capital ended up being located in the 8th century, okay? That family line then moves the capital from Nara, Japan, northwards by roughly about 25 miles, not very far, to a place which is called modern-day Kyoto. And the capital that they established there in 794 is called Heian. And so that's why you call that the Heian period. These periods are named after the political capitals where they were located, okay? And that goes from about 794 all the way to about 1185. So it's a fairly long period of time, all right? So there's a pattern here that we're seeing, right? Even with Korea, we're looking at the Three Kingdoms period from about 50 BC to the 7th century AD. And then by about 676, the Kingdom of Silla in southern Korea manages to conquer the rest of the other kingdoms on the Korean peninsula and consolidates that entire piece of peninsula under their own rule. And they go on for about 300 years, only to be taken over by another kingdom subsequently called the Goryeo Kingdom, which incidentally, for those of you who might have picked that up, is where the word Korea comes from, okay? Goryeo is what the term Korea comes from. So in 918, and then they go on for almost about 400 years. So this is an interesting period because we are seeing political consolidation by about the 6th and 7th centuries across the whole of East Asia, right? So much so that you have these big, powerful states that occupy these different geographical territories, right? Okay, in the different parts of East Asia that we're looking at. And importantly, their rule lasts for a substantial amount of time. So I don't know about you, but 300 or 400 years is a pretty long time, okay? So there's a lot that you can do during that period of time. So what we're doing today is sort of breaking it up into half. We'll look at the first half of this very long period of fairly stable political rule in East Asia. And then next time when we come back together again after next week, we'll look at the second half, okay? And we look at the global impact and interaction of East Asia in the second half of this period, which is a pretty important and interesting thing. So just a couple of maps, just to orientate ourselves. This is the Tang Dynasty at its height, roughly about 740, 742 AD, where the bulk of the Chinese landmass or the Chinese heartlands is basically under Chinese control, right? One single dynastic house. And what the Tang managed to do is extend their territorial holding militarily on the northwest side of the Asian continent into what is modern-day Central Asia. Okay, this is part of China today, but they end up stopping about here. Let me see if I can get the pen to function. Here we go. Okay. They end up stopping about here because the Arabs are also in ascendancy on the western half of this landmass, right, in the Middle East. By about 650, 750, the Abbasid dynasty is on its ascendancy. So the Arabs managed to stop the Tang troops in this part of Central Asia. And Central Asia is effectively divided into two for the next sort of 100 years, right? The eastern half under Chinese or Sinitic influence, the western half under Arabic or Middle Eastern influence. Importantly, they've extended their territories down towards the south, as well as, kind of towards the Korean Peninsula. So that's China. If we look at the Korean Peninsula, somewhat of the same story as well. In the 5th centuries AD, we have three major kingdoms, the kingdom of Goryeo, Bakche, and Silla. That's the reason why they call it the Three Kingdoms period. And then obviously you have these small little bits of space, which we did in terms of the gallery visit, the Gaia and exhibition in Korean National Museum that we just did for the asynchronous exercise. And the reason why it's not a fourth kingdom and the Four Kingdoms period is because Gaia was essentially a confederacy of different tribes, okay? Whereas these three were major kingdoms. But by about 676, all of those lands were conquered by Silla, and the Korean Peninsula basically came under a single political rule, right? With the bureaucratic structures that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the adoption of Chinese script, and then along with that, diplomatic relations with China and Japan, And so what we were seeing here in the Korean Peninsula by about the 7th century is a full-fledged major powers kind of a geopolitical situation, okay? Very, very different from the last 500 years. Along with that, I think were a couple of really, really interesting economic developments. The first one, which has already been going on for a very long time, but became amplified in this period of time, is the control of massive floodplains. For the purpose of agricultural output, what we were seeing is huge floodplains actually being under a single political control. And in Japan, in China, and in Korea, a series of land reforms so that you could capitalize on agricultural output through taxation, okay, through taxation, became one of the most important developments in the first millennium AD. Now, that's a bit different from what was going on prior to that. For example, in the first and second millennium BC, in China, for example, where it was about pulling together agricultural output, grain, right? And then the people, okay, together into like a single place. Here, what we were seeing is taxation so that you could generate disposable income, both for the state and as well for the people. So in other words, trade was becoming very, very vibrant in Japan, in China, and in Korea, okay? And the basis of that is a fiscal policy system that allowed you to tax the produce of the land, okay? So that you actually generated multiplier effects in the economy, which is very different from a command economy where you're trying to control all the rice output, or the agricultural output. You're now just doing taxation, okay? So Japan was doing that. China was doing that. Korea was doing that as well. And the result was a series of urbanization processes that took place in East Asia by about the 6th century AD that marked it out as being very different from what had been going on before. So now most of you guys might remember this slide that we've seen before about the standardization of and the formation of state, decentralized state in North Asia, when we were talking about consolidation at the end of the first millennium BC. We looked at the currency systems and so on and so forth before as well. And very often this is a key idea in terms of administration, that you actually needed to have an urban center which has administrators there so that you can control, right, all the land and the economy that is in the vicinity. So this was a very important concept that was developed in China roughly about 5, 6 centuries BC, became widespread in Northeast Asia and brought into, I think, much greater detail and articulation by the time we're thinking about the 6th and 7th centuries AD here, okay? So just as an example of what I mean by that, Gyeongju, which is the capital of the Silla Empire kingdom by the end of the 7th century, it's been around for a very long time, okay? At least, I think the 3rd century AD, you already had this place being the capital of the Silla kingdom, okay? But by about 668, when the entire Korean peninsula is consolidated into a single political whole or entity, what you saw in Gyeongju itself, the capital, was the development of a city that had roughly about 750,000 people at that time. And by some accounts, by historians, it probably was the 4th largest city in Asia in the 7th century. So it's kind of big. One thing to bear in mind is the size. So it's about 5 miles across in terms of space here, surrounded by all these mountain ridges or high hill ridges here. And so the only amount of arable land to some extent is actually relatively small. The arable land would probably be here, the city center itself, much space of which would have been taken up for residency, support services, to the kingdom's administration. This part here, maybe over here, right? So there are quite a bit of land, but it's not a lot. So this is actually emblematic of the Korean Peninsula. Very mountainous, you have valleys, and the amount of land that is there is somewhat big, but not huge, okay? So land control becomes very important, and the economic sort of, stimulus that you can gain from controlling it is actually critically important. I put down here 5 miles because I wanted everybody to just have a sense of the scale of the city. It's actually not much bigger than Flagstaff. So if you think of Flagstaff, right, nestled in the mountains, that's kind of what Gyeongju is like, okay, for the Silla Kingdom, okay? If you zoom in to the city, because the city began roughly about the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, you notice that the capital city itself is actually an interesting shape, okay? It's kind of circular, somewhat organic, okay? The palace precinct, they suspect, is probably somewhere located here. Right now, there are a number of archaeological excavations that are taking place here, and also actually over on this side as well, and over here. They're really actually having a really interesting time. And I use interesting in a facetious way because while they actually have a sense that this is the location of the capital, okay, they actually have a problem locating the locus of the capital itself, right, the city itself. In other words, we kind of know it's located here, but we just cannot nail down exactly where, for example, the palace is located, the administrative buildings are located, and so on and so forth, okay? Now, all of that is to say that this is actually a very organic city. I think part of the reason is being it was not built at a time where the notion of the administrative city was the rule, all right? So 3rd century AD is still very early in East Asia in terms of the notion of the city being the administrative sort of visible manifestation, okay? China would be the only exception to that rule, but definitely in Japan and in Korea, that was not the case yet. And so it looks organic, and that's part of the reason why you don't have what we call a right-angled shape, you know, like a triangle or a rectangle or an octagon or pentagon. I mean, those are what we call artificial shapes, okay, inorganic shapes in terms of city layout. So this is very organic in terms of the way the city is laid out. But one of the interesting things that happens in Gyeongju is that by about the 7th century, there is a second site that is located, and it's not a counterpoint city. In fact, it is actually just a religious center that supports Buddhism. And that is the Buddhist grottos that are located on the hillside, like quite far away, roughly about 7 or 8 miles away from the city center. So here's an interesting feature in Northeast Asia, quite apart from China, actually. This originates in Korea. And that is that state sponsorship of religion, in this case, Buddhism, right, is manifest by the building of a religious center that actually is located somewhat away from the main administrative center. One would have thought, for example, that they would have put the Buddhist center in the city itself, right? So that everybody can actually see what's going on, okay? But for whatever reason, they thought it was a good idea, the best idea, to locate the Buddhist center of learning and practice that's sponsored by the state away from the urban center itself in a fairly rural location, which in this case was the slopes of the mountains nearby, okay? And this correlation between the city center and the urban and the Buddhist center or religious center being far away, that urban-rural dialectic is something that we see in the first instance in the case of Korea. We don't see it anywhere else. And interestingly, is adopted in Japan in the 8th century, okay? So all that you read in the textbooks, by the way, if you've been reading your textbooks, especially Ibree's textbook on China, right, that the cities of East Asia kind of mirror Chang'an, that is true, but only after the 7th century. That doesn't happen in East Asia until like the 8th and 9th centuries, okay? In East Asia, apart from China, obviously, we're talking about Korea and Japan, okay? City center layout and the philosophy of urban centers and how we should think about it actually originates from Korea, all right? While China has its own philosophy and logic, okay, to the location and the layout of urban centers and religious centers of learning. So Nara, for example, in Japan, And here is just a map just to give you a sense of the floodplains that the capital city of Nara, of the Yamato Kingdom, was in control of. It's the Osaka floodplains. I'll have a slide later on to show you the full extent of the floodplains. They were under the different fees, but by about 538 came under sort of a singular rule. They were able to tax it. And the size is pretty large, roughly about 15 to 20 miles across, surrounded by hills again. And so on this particular location, they located a capital city that's located in this particular area here, right? The city was built, or rather the palace was built in 708, okay? The city is, as a place where people lived and planted crops and lived and existed, has been around for many centuries, since the 3rd century BC. But it's the 708 that the Yamato Kingdom essentially establishes a administrative center there, okay? And in this regard, they're starting to at least look like it was an intentional city, right? That was sited and then built for the purpose of administration. Because why? The shape is what? Okay, square, right? It's a right-angled shape, okay? And so unlike Gyeongju, where it's a circle, probably grew out of a cluster of villages and so on and so forth, over time became bigger and bigger, Nara really was an intentional administrative center that was built, okay? To some extent, we could think of this as mirroring this philosophical concept is starting to come up, okay? And so I think Chinese influence is slowly starting to seep into the rest of Northeast Asia in terms of administrative centers at the urban center formation, right? But the interesting thing about this city is the correlation between the capital city again and the Buddhist center, okay, which you don't find in Chinese cities anymore after the Shang period comes to an end, okay? So the Chinese have not been doing this for at least about 1,500 years. And instead, this is a Korean concept that was imported into Nara, Japan, and they did exactly the same thing. So the city or the administrative center and the palace is located here, right? And then for those of you who can remember, what are these guys? Anyone online or even here in class? Does anybody know what those things are? Tombs, yep, they are the Kofun tombs, right, that we talked about, right? That date to about the 5th to 7th centuries, at least for this cluster here in Nara, okay? So some of the old practices, they're still continuing. They plonk an administrative center here. But interestingly, they then built a Buddhist center of learning that is completely patronized by the state, right? By the Yamato state, okay? And it's called the Todaiji Temple, where the biggest Buddhist statue that's made of gilt bronze at that time in the world was cast and then sort of housed under a really huge superstructure and located about 2.5 miles away from the city near the slopes that were located nearby. Okay, so that idea of the urban-rural dialectic again, where you have the urban center, which is the political seat of power, and then the rural area, which is sort of like the aesthetic or religious, right, area that you would run away to for spiritual renewal continues, right? And this is actually a Korean concept that was brought into Nara, Japan. What was happening in China at that point in time? So interestingly, as the Tang Dynasty was established in 618, they decided that they would site the capital or locate the capital in the area of Xianyang and Chang'an, which is where, you know, the Qin dynasty had its capital, and the Han dynasty after the Qin dynasty had its capital to 220 AD. And the Tang dynasty thought, well, you know what, I think it's a good idea to use that space, obviously because it has a certain sort of, you know, political significance as well. You're kind of reestablishing a unified China. And so they built a city in 618 in the area of Chang'an and called it New Chang'an. Okay, they called it New Chang'an, okay? And it had a couple of interesting features, mainly as an administrative center, okay? It was the key focal point, obviously, of the empire, the Chinese state. But one of the things that they did was the city actually had a very defined space. So the city is surrounded by a wall, okay? And so you actually have a physical demarcation feature that indicates that this is the city, all right? It had an administrative center, obviously, so this is the key administrative center that administered the rest of the empire. It had 118 wards, and by that they mean the spaces in between here. Each of these squares or rectangles that I'm circling now effectively had about 5 or 6 wards, okay? And so wards are basically spaces where you would have a cluster of houses. But each of these wards also had a what? Had a wall surrounding it, okay? So you also had walls surrounding this space. You had walls surrounding this space. You had walls surrounding this space. And so then even for all of these areas here, each of them, you know, you would have walls, for example, that would demarcate the spaces within that space. So it's a city basically that is demarcated, and the demarcation feature is what? The wall, okay? A little tidbit about Tang Chang'an, and that is that once sundown, you actually had a curfew. So the walls were important because it was a means of controlling the population that was within, right, this urban center itself, okay? And the curfew was utilized as a means of preventing people from doing, you know, weird shenanigans, you know, after the sun went up. And so the wall had a real feature. Now, all the other East Asian cities up to this point and beyond for at least another 200 to 300 years did not have this feature. So this Chinese city is actually unique in this regard, okay? And in some ways, it was kind of like a microcosm of the state of China and of course how it saw the rest of the world as well, okay? One thing that I wanted to highlight about the Chinese city that was vastly different from the 2 other cities that we've seen so far, and that is this, right? So you actually have these things here, and basically what they are Buddhist temples, which were under the patronage of the imperial court. And notice that they are not like tucked away in some hillside or mountain far away, right? They're where they? They're right smack in the city center itself, okay? So it's a very interesting difference, I think, that we see in 7th century China compared to Korea and Japan up until about the end of the 8th century. The floodplains that the Chinese city of Chang'an was obviously drawing from was substantially larger, much more massive than, say, Japan, Nara, Japan, or even Silla, Korea. And just to give you a scale, a sense of the scale, so this is the city of Chang'an is located here. This floodplain, just this area alone, is about 110 miles. So the entire floodplain from this point all the way to here is roughly about a good 250, almost 300 miles long, okay? And roughly about 30 to 50 miles wide, depending on which point of the width you are measuring. So this is a humongous piece of land, okay? And that's the reason why the city of Chang'an itself is in fact a massive city, even just that administrative center that was demarcated by the wall. So the city of Chang'an is basically about this size. It's about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles long and wide. It's a square. This is about how big it is. And then obviously this is the administrative like core, right? This is where all the ministries are located. The bureaucracy is located there, okay? Pretty spectacular if you ask me, because it's huge, right? It's really, really big. There have been talks that, you know, at the height of the Tang Dynasty, the capital of Chang'an had maybe about anywhere from about 5 million to 20 million people. I don't think you could have squeezed 20 million people into that small little square in the 7th century, because obviously you don't have high-rise buildings. I think what they meant by that is the much larger environs or area around the city, right, would have had millions and millions of people, okay? But that in the middle is basically the administrative center in the city that administered that entire floodplains area that I talked about here in this earlier slide. Okay, so it's huge, right? The economic base of the city is tremendously large. Okay, and then just a zoom in for anybody who may have the opportunity to ever visit there. This is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's kind of interesting because they have actually a lot of new buildings, like reconstructed buildings in there. So if you look at it, I'm like, wow, okay, everything's kind of like new and not really from the Tang period. But as an archaeological site, it's actually a phenomenal piece of land that you could actually play around. And the Chinese archaeology units have really had a really wonderful time doing that. The satellite image also shows, right, the administrative center here. And I don't know if you can actually see well enough, but the demarcation of the walls, like the wall area, which is the demarcation, is actually quite clear from the satellite image. Now, if you zoom in today, it's actually a road and a park. It's kind of like a Central Park. So it's kind of narrow and long, okay, and it forms this rectangle here, okay? And that's the reason for that is because by the 13th century, when the Mongols overtook this entire place, they essentially pulled the entire walls apart, okay? So unfortunately, none of that is left. But the space that the walls actually occupied in the Tang Dynasty when this capital was built remained. And so it's interesting that it was converted into a road and some parks area, and that continued for the next 700 years until the present time. So today, if you go there, this is what you will see. You won't see a massive wall. You'll actually just see like this very wide road with, you know, green spaces and so on and so forth. But that's where the wall used to sit, okay? And again, it's an inorganic city because it is an administrative center. And so because of that, one of the biggest telltale signs is the level of organization, which leads to a right angle shape, okay? So that's one of the things that we learn in urban history, is to look at the shape and then think about it and see what it tells you about why the city actually exists and how it's grown and what it functions of, okay? So the Tang Dynasty does that in the beginning of the 7th century, and it actually gets picked up in Japan after the city of Nara, or the capital of Nara is built, right? So the capital of Nara is built at the beginning of the 8th century. So about 701, 702 is finalized in 708. And that city functions for about 100 years before they move the capital northwards to Kyoto. So Nara is located here. Kyoto is located here. So they move the capital at the end of the 8th century northwards towards Kyoto. And when the Yamato kingdom decides to actually establish the new capital up in Kyoto, one of the inspirations that they do by the 8th century look at is, in fact, China. Okay, and I think part of the reason has to do with the fact that by the end of the 8th century, Japan, under the Yamato kingdom, has established, at least for 200 years, a very consistent and fairly intense diplomatic relationship with China by this point in time. And so its ambassadors are used to visiting the city of Chang'an, right, the imperial capital, as part of their diplomatic missions. People are traveling from China and being sent by the imperial court to Japan. And so what you have is a fairly intense exchange of ideas at the administrative level, okay, in the administrative sphere, for about 100 years, okay, after the capital of Chang'an is built, right, in the 7th century. So more than 100 years later, with all that interaction, when a new capital is about to be established in Yamato, Japan, their inspiration is no longer the Korean peninsula, but instead what? China, okay? And the floodplains that is the Osaka area today is much larger than Korea. So you can almost imagine the notion of aggrandizement and comparison with other powerful states in the region, right, begins, right? And if you think about the Silla kingdom, by the end of the 8th century, it's kind of starting to begin to decline because of internal strife and so on and so forth. But more importantly, its economic base is not as big as the Yamato kingdom itself, okay? So, you're seeing some of those sorts of competitiveness, I think, even in terms of the urban settlement and the urban formation that establishes by the end of the 8th century onwards. Right? Japan is starting to think of itself as being much more powerful or stronger than even the Korean kingdoms, which is interesting because 200-300 years before that, the direction is what? The asymmetrical relationship is in the other direction, okay? So things do change over time, even if it takes 300 years, okay? Just saying, all right? There was another question. So is there only one administrative center? No. So obviously places like Chang'an, Nara, Heian or Kyoto in the 9th century in Japan, Gyeongju in the Korean Peninsula, they are the largest administrative centers of each of the kingdoms they represent, okay, because these are the capitals. But you also have urban centers that are located throughout all these different kingdoms, obviously because they needed to administer the lands, that is, and then the whole of the Korean Peninsula is pretty large. So you had a series of different cities. I think in the Korean case, it's roughly about 500 in total. But obviously, those other cities are much smaller, okay, than the kingdom's capital or the imperial capital in China, or the capital, for example, in Yamato, Japan. Okay, so it's not that there aren't any other cities. It's just that they probably would have been much smaller in scale. Okay, and obviously do the same thing too. It's just lower level, activities. Let me see. So the capital is moved northwards to what is today Kyoto from the Nara area. And again, just as an example of the size of the floodplains that we're looking at, a city like Heian, for example, once it's established in the northern part of the Osaka floodplains, the size of the lands that it controls as an economic base is fairly large, right? So just in the valley where Kyoto is located, it's already about 15-20 miles long, okay? And then if you think about this, it's, obviously significantly longer. So all of this area, in terms of its land resources, become basically the economic base, right, of this major city here. And they established the city of Heian, which is Heina, okay? There, roughly at the beginning of the 9th century. And so, hey, that's the downtown area of Kyoto today. This is a 18th century map or reproduction of what they thought the city of Heian was in the 9th century when it was first established. And this part here, which is the main door or gate, right, city gate, into the administrative core and palace area of the Yamato ruler's palace and his administrative ministerial offices and so on and so forth, is actually located in this spot here. Okay, so there's a castle today that still is located in there. Was not built in the Yamato period, was not built in the 9th century, although it sits on the land of where the Heian Palace was located from the 9th century until roughly about the 12th century AD. Okay, this palace actually comes from the Tokugawa period, so roughly about the 14th, 15th century. And the entire thing is built of wood. So it's actually a pretty amazing architectural thing if you would visit it. But it's not from, right, the late Yamato period, okay? It's not from the Heian period. So the city probably extended about this size. And then this is the administrative center that you're looking at here. The important thing that I would like to highlight here is twofold, right? So one, it starts to look like what? A Chinese administrative center. Okay, so this is undeniable that that's the case. But the interesting thing is that the Japanese do not adopt everything that is developed in China. And one of the most important things they don't have is, in fact, a city wall that surrounds the outer sort of, periphery of the city itself. The wall only exists in this particular location, okay? This is where the wall is located. So in other words, it's still mirroring something that looks like what? like this, right? Okay, where you have that administrative core. So it's kind of like Nara, right, in the beginning of the 8th century. So the administrative core has a wall that surrounds it, but the rest of the city beyond the administrative core is actually, sort of developing on its own without any boundaries, demarcating, and so on and so forth. Okay, and you see that continuing, at least in the case of Heian, when it's sort of built and established at the beginning of the 9th century AD. Okay, so here's a diorama. And then when we think about these things, I think one of the things we really need to consider is like history and its role in society. And I don't mean in the 9th century, okay? So as the city of Kyoto, and they sort of establish a couple of UNESCO sites. One of those things about national aggrandizement is like, how great is your history, right? And how far has it gone into the past? When will we like really sophisticated? And then, of course, it's a competitive thing. So, like, compared to someone else or another group of people or a different country, how great will we? Okay, so those are the kind of questions that come up when we write history, okay, today, especially. And so for Kyoto, one of the things, and for Japan, one of the things that they were really keen on was like, let's sort of try to show, okay, how grand Heian was as a city at its peak when it was first established in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, okay? And so they built this diorama. By the way, none of this exists anymore from the 9th century, okay? So every bit of this is somebody's what? Imagination, all right? An interpretation of whatever is available, okay? So this is exciting and tremendously like, whoa. I don't know about you, but it looks like Chang'an in the Tang Dynasty if you were trying to reconstruct it. So everybody's sort of trying to hit that mark, right? In terms of the medieval city or capital in East Asia at the end of the first millennium AD. And then the Japanese are no different from anybody who wants to be nationalistic about their history. Okay, so this is a good example of that. So, you could argue, well, yeah, because the layout looks like that. And then guess what? The Koreans also want to do the same thing, except that the only thing that they can bang on right now is the capital of Silla, right, in Gyeongju. And so this is a computerized reconstruction of what they think Gyeongju looked like at the peak of the Silla capital. And I hate to say this, but you know what? I don't think this was what it looked like. Okay, this is too organized, too right angle. It's not like the organic kind of city that we were seeing from the satellite maps. And this was done in 2013. And the Korean government actually put a lot of money into Gyeongju to try to reconstruct this thing in like live in the city itself, to try to do that. I think the project was stopped because UNESCO basically said, no, you can't do that because it's just going to destroy the entire UNESCO site, because that site, that small little patch of land is actually inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site right now. Okay, so I think they were told that they were going to lose the listing and inscription if they went ahead with it. So this has remained a pipe dream in Korea. But nonetheless, right, everybody kind of wants to look like that, okay, even though that was not the case in the past. So just some interesting things to think about. And so you have these cities and increasingly urbanized population, right, within these large states, right, of Silla, for example, Yamato, Japan, Tang, China. And then along with all of that and the interaction they have within themselves, are a series of other interactions or communication lines that were established outside, right, of Northeast Asia. So the Yellow Sea sees a lot of traffic because of the stability by the 8th and 9th centuries AD. In places like Southeast Asia, the Chinese rule along the coast basically allows them to consolidate the passageways near the coastal areas of the South China Sea. And so ships are coming up from Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia and arriving in South China, okay? And the other way around as well, obviously. In Central Asia, because of the peace that they have with the Abbasid Arabs by about 750, and the treaties, there's a treaty that was signed which was known as the Treaty of Talas. Central Asia becomes a secure route between the East and the West. So the Silk Road reopens in a big way so that traffic can, sort of traverse across Central Asia from Europe into the Middle East, all the way eastwards to China and obviously back as well, okay? And the result of that is that you see a confluence of cultures. There's a cosmopolitan nature, not just of Tang Chinese society, but of the Japanese society and the Korean, Korean Peninsula society as well. The same thing could be said of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East. I mean, the list goes on, but because of our focus in this course on the geographical region of Northeast Asia, and when we think about it, Japan, Korea, and China became more open as a result of this trans-regional security that we are seeing here by the 8th and 9th century, so much so that there was a huge movement of people across the whole of the Asian continent. Things like religious and learning became increasingly sort of, practiced and became important. There was a huge amount of patronage, not just imperial and royal patronage, but people who were rich and the political elite were patronizing religion and learning. And this is the period of time, for example, for Buddhism. A huge amount of the sutras that we understand of the Buddhist canon, right, were composed, written, and codified, right, and kept in libraries and archives during this period of time. Okay, so, and you had interesting things like Indian Buddhist scholars would go to China and reside for 10 years to do that. Chinese Buddhist scholars would, travel to India, to Nalanda, which is the Indian seat of Buddhist learning at that time, to learn and then to write these sutras and come and bring them back. Same thing with Japan, China. So there's this huge exchange of people. And along with that, obviously, you would have the artistic sort of, side of things, the aesthetic side of things, including things like artisan crafts, painting, music. There was a huge exchange of ideas, practices, and the hybridization and adaptation of all these kinds of things happening in Northeast Asia. So for the rest of the class today, for the next 15 minutes, we'll just go over some slides just to see what those manifestations are. So this map is just to show you the routes and the exchanges. I really don't like this map, but it was kind of one of the few that I could find on hand, because I think it doesn't show you the volume of exchange. It just shows you the lines of exchange, but it doesn't really show you the volume, right, of exchange that we are looking at here, okay? So Longmen, which is in Dunhuang, for example, and your asynchronous exercise for this week, you'll be looking at some of these things under the VR exhibitions from the Dunhuang Caves, which, by the way, is a World UNESCO Heritage Site as well. Very interesting. So if you were standing here, I don't know if you can see this guy here. Okay, so these are massive statues, right? So this was commissioned by the Empress Wu Zetian of the Tang Dynasty. And in 675, she was a Buddhist. I mean, she was Chinese, obviously. She was the empress to the emperor of the Tang Dynasty. The husband was the emperor. And so she was extremely wealthy, high status, and commissioned this particular set of statues that were to be carved into the cliff. Okay, so it's a huge amount of work. But importantly, if you actually think of the finesse of the carving, both in terms of the bas reliefs, which is on the walls, as well as the 3D sculptures that had to be carved in situ, right, into the caves. This is a tremendous artistic achievement, okay? Some of the things that we think about when we look at something like this would be, for example, we look at the facial features, very, very Sinitic Chinese in nature. All right, same thing as well for this person. And this Buddha, because it's Mahayana Buddhism, so there are lots of bodhisattvas and so on and so forth, is the manifestation of the Buddha, which is called Vairocana, which I don't know if you can remember from another lecture we had, the last lecture we had, where this is the Buddha that is featured in the Todaiji temple, right? That was built in the 8th century in Nara, Japan. And this is the Buddha who is supposed to be like the universal Buddha that's over everybody else. Okay, so this Empress Wu Zetian obviously was thinking about something when she commissioned, okay, this particular Buddha and these sculptures, okay, for as a merit-making sort of act, right, by her. Incidentally, in about 25 years, when her husband dies and she then kills a couple of her own sons, she finally enthrones herself as the emperor of the Tang Dynasty. She's like the only female in Chinese imperial history, dynastic history, that actually becomes the emperor, okay? And that's true Buddhism, because Confucianism would never allow that, right? And Confucianism is a very patriarchal sort of a philosophy. And so the ruler, the son of heaven, always has to be a male, all right? What she does is she actually commissions a very eminent Buddhist scholar to look at a particular sutra from India that actually talks about Vairocana and Manjushri, which is a bodhisattva, one of the bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, and makes the argument that in that sutra itself, one of the manifestations of Manjushri is actually a female ruler who brings benevolence and benevolent rule to all the people. Okay, and that monk then concludes that guess what? This empress is actually this particular manifestation of the matriarch. Okay, so of matriarch. Sorry, not Manjushri, but matriarch. And so of course she's like, wow, I didn't know I was a manifestation of a bodhisattva, right? That's supposed to bring universal rule and be benevolent to everybody. So I'm fine with taking the throne, all right? And she does, okay, in 701. A number of the princes of the Tang Dynasty revolt. She basically gets upset with them, kills lots of them, puts a lot of them in jail, blinds a whole bunch of them. She actually stays on the throne all the way until she actually dies, okay? So all the scholars of the Tang Dynasty really hate her and vilified her for that. But just in terms of just as a unique point in Chinese history and the role of Buddhism in politics, I think actually is a really interesting one. All right, so another example of state patronage of Buddhism in Korea, where the grotto that I was talking about near Gyeongju, dug into the caves and the side of the hill, and again, right, a Buddha image. And by the way, again, this is the Buddha, what? Vairocana, right? So the universal Buddha again, right? So state patronage of Buddhism has a very strong agenda in East Asia, and that is, I'm over everybody else, okay? And the articulation of that is very important. And again, in the Todaiji, in the 7th century AD, on the side of the hill near the capital Nara, again, it's the same thing that I'm trying to say, right? With the Vairocana Buddha again, okay? So Buddhism is utilized, I think, for state purposes, all right, which is really, really, really important. All right, so and as this practice of state patronage goes on in Buddhism, Korea, for example, begins to develop by the 11th century, libraries and archives pertaining to Buddhist sutras. And so here the Tripitaka Koreana is another good example of that, which is not. This is not under Silla anymore because the kingdom of Silla demises at the end of the 10th century. This is the successor state, the Goryeo kingdom, that does this. And this, by the way, still exists today. These are all woodblock prints. So you could, in principle, pull it out, put a piece of paper with some ink and actually print, all right, the entire Tripitaka, which is all the sutras that are known, okay, in East Asia under the Buddhist canon. So it's a pretty phenomenal achievement. And everybody's trying to do that, right? So it's a really interesting thing. The flow of people, the 6th century diplomatic missions to China under the Tang Dynasty, where you have people from Northeast Asia, and so Yamato Japan, for example, Silla Korea, Pakche, which is another kingdom in the Korean Peninsula. But I brought this up because I wanted you to look at the clothes that they're wearing, okay? The details of the clothes that they're wearing is actually quite detailed, including things, for example, like the sashes here, okay? Notice that there's hardly a belt, at least for the people from Korea. So even though they're nearby, and they probably use the same kind of textile material, the way they dress themselves are very different. The Japanese look like they are very, very keen on prints, all right? So the cloth of the Yamato envoy has a lot of these prints on them, whereas the people from Silla, very plain in terms of their dress sense. And this, which is, the image is not very clear, but basically it's a brocade, right? It's a brocaded image, okay? And so all the different kinds of weaving techniques that you might think of, brocade applique that's put onto a piece of textile, because obviously he's a man of stature in the Bakche kingdom. You know, we see all these different things coming out. The headdresses, for example, are very different depending on where you're coming from, even the mustache, okay, the beard. Whereas, for example, in the case of the Japanese from the Yamato kingdom, you know, your facial feature hair is probably a mark of your status. And finally, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but this guy's not wearing any shoes. The Chinese obviously noted that, right? Whereas the Koreans were wearing shoes, okay? And in the Chinese context, actually, that is a very important marker of the degree of civilizational attainment that your culture has. Cultures that arrive without shoes were always regarded as being somewhat lower, okay, than cultures that actually were wearing shoes. So that's a really interesting observation, just this image itself, which is dated to about the 7th century. It tells you a lot about what the Chinese were looking out in terms of their compatriots in the other parts of East Asia. The Mokau caves, more of the textiles, but I just wanted to show you this particular one, which was, you know, dramatically different from everybody else. And the military uniform of this particular character here, which is the Lokapala, so he's like a general, okay, a celestial general. That was kind of the military gear that they were wearing at that time in China in the 8th century, and so it's depicted there. I'll skip this because we're slowly running out of time. I think I only have 2 more minutes. And musical instruments. So the 6th century, a lot of instruments were coming across from Central Asia into places like China, for example, okay? And so you have the lute, right? This is kind of like the Middle Eastern kind of guitar, okay? And you also have what is like a harp, okay? So it's kind of like a handheld harp. These were all instruments that were played in the Middle East by the first millennium BC. So over time, during this period of time, because of the security across the Central Asia, they were starting to sort of flow into places like China and eventually made their way to places like Japan and Korea. So by the 8th century, you see them in Chinese sculptures, for example, tomb sculptures. So this again is the harp, the handheld harp. You have little sort of cymbals, which is a Chinese instrument. But interestingly, this lute here is played by hand. About 300 years later, the Chinese have adapted it and actually have a wooden pedal that they would use to play the peep harp, okay? So there's some kind of localization that's going on, right? I don't know what this is. I think there's kind of like a pipe organ, a reed pipe organ, but nobody really sort of knows for sure. And seems a bit odd that she's clapping when everybody else is playing an instrument. So I think there's a piece that's missing there. Other examples from even further away. So Afghanistan gold crown that was excavated from a tomb in Afghanistan and is dated to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The style of the crown looks highly familiar and similar to the crown of one of the kings of the Silla kingdom from the 6th century AD. Okay, and so there must have been some kind of artistic exchange across what is effectively a really great space, right? From Afghanistan all the way to the Korean Peninsula. And finally, while that influence could have possibly seeped into China, because China is on the way from Afghanistan to the Korean Peninsula, notice that the Chinese crown, right, is very, very different from what? The Korean crown. Okay, and so not all ideas were necessarily assimilate. Just because it came doesn't mean that you would adopt them, right? You did pick and choose depending on what your cultural inclinations were, and so on and so forth. Okay, and it's really interesting how some things would be picked up and some things would not. So I'm just going to end here. 3 key points to think about before we go into the next lecture. We're looking at East Asia as fairly cosmopolitan by the second half of the first millennium AD. And then, of course, the role of the state is critically important in terms of this cultural interaction because they facilitated it and also patronized it. And finally, the external linkages and global integrations that actually allow these cosmopolitan sort of, interactions to occur cannot be understated. And that will be something that we'll take up as a topic of interest next week. And we come back for class lecture, we look at the end of the first millennium into the beginning of the second millennium in terms of the global interactions and impact that East Asia had on the rest of the world.